Hello, my name is Jerry Wilson, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Racial Equity in Education. CRE's mission is to work toward the day when race will no longer be the single most important predictor for educational outcomes for students of color. Teaching in Color is all about building supportive networks for educators of color and prompting policy change. And the way that we're doing that is through storytelling. Stories have the ability to connect people, not just person to person, but to build communities around shared understanding. And we know that certainly educators of color have shared experiences in schools. The research shows us that teachers of color are more likely to feel isolated and are more likely to exit the profession from feeling overworked and undervalued. Teaching in Color is also about prompting policy change. We know that research and data are very important when it comes to policy. Policymakers are people, and people are often moved by stories. So we're collecting stories from educators of color, stories that often go unnoticed by colleagues, by administrators, and certainly by policymakers, and putting those stories front and center for everyone to see and hear. So we're collecting stories in several different ways for Teaching in Color. One way is through the Teaching in Color mixtape, which is due out at the beginning of June. We got educators of color and musicians from North Carolina and around the country to come together to create original music that really speaks to the experiences of educators and students of color. We're also telling stories through the Teaching in Color magazine, which will be released soon. So we went around the state of North Carolina and spoke with educators of color to find out how they're experiencing this moment and what sorts of things they want policymakers and the public to know. We also held a virtual summit and in-person storytelling event. We brought together experts from around the country to speak specifically to the experiences of educators of color, to talk about the things that they experience on a daily basis and the challenges unique to their experiences and how to overcome them. Another way that we're collecting stories from educators of color is through our partnership with We Are the Dream. We've been hosting virtual storytelling workshops for educators of color, but also for parents and students of color. We're excited to connect with other organizations from around the country who are also storytelling to move policy. We know that if we work together, we are even stronger in our efforts and more effective at reaching the policymakers and the people who need to hear these stories. We know that there's a coordinated campaign against racial equity efforts in schools right now. Those who are behind this effort are listening to a vocal minority of voices. The voices that are missing from this discussion are parents, students, and educators of color. We are working towards a day when students of color feel safe and welcome in every school in which they find themselves. We're working towards a day when educators of color no longer feel overburdened and undervalued, when we recognize the powerful contribution of teachers of color to the learning of all students, but particularly students of color, and respond accordingly with policies that support and that undergird that valuable work that educators of color do. We're advocating for a day when policies no longer leave some students hanging, when policies reflect the best interests of all students, and we only get there by centering the experiences and the needs of those who are most marginalized. My own experiences as a student are what led me to work in education, first as a classroom teacher, and now as somebody who works on advocacy and policy. When I was in the 4th grade, I had a teacher who would publicly embarrass me for not doing my homework. And I still remember the pain that I felt in those days. Up until that point, I absolutely loved school. But that year, something changed. And it continued the next year when my teacher left midway through the year, and we had a rotating cast of substitutes, and it was chaos that year. And it continued the next year when my 6th grade teacher thought that I was incapable of learning. And had it not been for my mother coming up to the school and protesting, I don't know where my educational journey would have gone. And it wasn't until the end of the year, that 6th grade year, when we got the test results back from the end of grade test, and I outscored the rest of the class. And my teacher told my mom, whoops, I guess he knew more than he let on. And I know that there's no excuse for that, and that students of color are still experiencing those things in the classroom. But that's what led me to become a teacher and to do the work that I do now, trying to improve educational experiences and outcomes for students of color, to make sure that nobody has to go through what I went through as a student. If you would like to learn more about Teaching in Color, you can visit us on social media, Teach in Color NC on Instagram and Twitter, or you can visit teachingincolor.org, our website, for more information. We can't wait to hear your story.